Thank you, everyone. Welcome back. So this session, we have Rani and Jaimon to talk about how to manage, understand OT risk, a popular topic at the moment. Do feel free to submit any questions. We will be having a quiz at the end of this as well. A quiz on the Kehat platform where we'll run through the questions on the screen and you can log in. I'll post the link and the pin code into the chat afterwards, after this slide, and then you can log in and wait there until the end of the session where we'll then test your knowledge on this. So I'll hand over to you, Jaimon, to start us off and start the introductions.
Yeah, so thanks, Ben. Good morning, good afternoon. So I'm Jaimon Thomas. So I lead the customer solutions and architecture team for CyberProof. So to lead this session, I have the pleasure of having Rani Kehat. He's an industry veteran with decades of experience in the OT space, specifically around securing OT environments, risk management, governance, building cyber defense capabilities around critical infrastructures. Rani have held senior positions at many large organizations, including EMC and Elbit. And currently, Rani is the CISO and VP of Business Development at Radiflow. So Rani, many thanks for taking the time and welcome to the session.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So the objective of our session is to walk through some of the key factors that will help us understand OT risk and see how we can assess them for their likelihood and impact, and also effectively communicate this to the wider team, so that we can start building our cyber defense capabilities to manage and mitigate the cyber risk. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Rani, so that you can just walk through some of the agenda items and then get started. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jaimon. These are the topics that we're going to go through. It's quite a lot for a short session of 40 minutes, but we'll try and get as much information in, and happy to take in questions. We're going to concentrate on risk in OT environments and the methodology. We'll go through these bullets that you see up here, so it's quite a lot. So let's get started, and just a little bit on taxonomy, because there are different ways of that people will define certain words. So let's start with the threat. In short, a threat is a loss. Okay, so we're looking at what is the impact? That is our threat. Now, threat, you have the kind of another word that's called a threat source, sometimes referred to as a threat actor, and that is the situation or the area or the intent of someone who actually wants to bring the threat into realization. So you would say, for example, that a certain insider threat, a certain worker has the intention of performing the threat of data loss, for example. A vulnerability, here there's quite a few different definitions, but usually a vulnerability is defined as a weakness, and that weakness can be in anything, whether it's a weakness in technology, whether it's a weakness in a process, whether it's a weakness in a procedure that you're doing, whether it's a weakness in people. I mean, lack of training, that's a weakness. So a weakness is anything, and we call those vulnerabilities. Some definitions would add, for example, if you guys are familiar with the Open Fair, they've added also that, I think quite rightly so, that a vulnerability means that it's a weakness that causes a loss. So not any vulnerability we should be looking at. We should be looking at weaknesses that by exploiting them will cause a loss. So those are the ones that we want to concentrate on. One small comment I would like to make about vulnerabilities. Usually when you do a threat assessment or when you talk to people about risks, then the word vulnerability always comes up, giving the impression that if there's no vulnerability, then there's no risk, which isn't quite the case. A vulnerability will definitely help raise the risk, but you don't have to have a vulnerability to have a risk. It's just a matter of how hard are you hit? How hard is the threat source? To give just a kind of a simplified example, you might have a lock, and you would say, if it's made out of plastic, the material is a vulnerability. That's a weak material to make a lock. True, if somebody is trying to open that lock and it's made out of plastic, the pin's inside, definitely a vulnerability. But what if you make an extremely wonderful lock made out of titanium, and it's you can find no vulnerability. It's no vulnerability in design. Everything is wonderful. And then you drive a car into it. Obviously, the door will fall. So it's not always when you look at an asset and you can't find a vulnerability, it doesn't mean that there's no risk. It just means you're better off. A lot of the attacks are also don't need a vulnerability. So it doesn't mean that if there's a threat actor, a threat source, he has to have a vulnerability to exploit in order to perform a loss scenario or to bring a threat into realization. There's a lot of attacks that you don't need any vulnerabilities. You're doing everything that is right, but yet the result is wrong. So vulnerability should be obviously looked at, but don't look at vulnerabilities, and everybody's talking about vulnerability scanning and so on and so forth. Don't get me wrong, it's very, very important, but don't be blinded by the fact that you've mapped all the vulnerabilities and you understood all the attack vectors and all the scenarios that can play out.
So Rani, just to add to that, so this is where the term configuration weakness comes into play as well, isn't it? Because when you are not configuring some of your devices properly, even if it does not have vulnerability, that can actually contribute to a threat, isn't it? So it doesn't need to be.
Yes, definitely. That's exactly it. I mean, misconfiguration and is definitely a vulnerability. Lack of control is a vulnerability. So definitely those will contribute to the ability of the threat actor, to perform his bad deeds. And that's when we come to the likelihood of occurrence, or sometimes called threat likelihood. And that one is a doozy. I mean, there is so much controversy and debate, I would say, around this issue. I'll go into it a little bit in this session. And that is trying to understand how do we actually give statistical probability to a scenario, a threat materializing, causing a loss, whether it's exploiting a vulnerability or not. Something bad happened. What is the probability of that happening? Again, there's a lot of ways to look at it, and we'll go into that in a moment. Okay. And again, if there's any questions, Ben, that you see that you think they're relevant, please, give me an opportunity kind of to break this long lecture. Impact. Okay, so impact is actually the loss or the bad thing that's happened. So that's, I think, usually fairly well understood. Impact in OT environments, obviously, we have things that have to do with safety. We have very strong regulations, sometimes dealing with environmental, handling toxic material, safety issue, and health issues if you're emitting something that's not so healthy into the air, and so on. You're under very strict regulations. Those regulations have hefty fines on them, and obviously that is a threat. And getting the fine of X amount of dollars or euros, that's obviously the impact. So we have to look at all these things as possibilities of impacts. The impact and the threat likelihood are the main actors or vectors or attributes or whatever you like to call in calculating risk. So we want to see a scenario. What impact would that scenario cause, i.e. loss? And what is the probability of that scenario happening? And as I mentioned before, probability is the hard part. Impact, I'm not saying it is easy, but impact is something that is relatively lends itself to be quantified. You know exactly how much a machine costs downtime. You know how much it will cost you to buy a new one. You will know exactly your RPO. You would know what are the legal fees if you have to now deal with something, or what is the cost now to bring in a cybersecurity company to clean up the mess. Those things you can get solid numbers, solid data, and calculate and quantify impact. The things that are harder for us as security people in any environment, but today we're talking about OT, is how to assess the probabilities and the likelihood of something bad happening. So that's about it on impact. Jaimon, if you have any questions or you want to jump in, please, feel free, and I'll let you know. Okay, so one of the things that we follow, and one of the leading standards in the OT industry that helps us assess risk and how to manage risk, is the IC 62443. Obviously, there's others. There's the NIST 830 and some others, and the NIS and so on. But let's talk a little bit about the 62443, which I personally find very clear. Just a few words on the NIST for anyone who's on the line or joining and is not familiar with this standard. This is a crash course. It's a framework. It's got kind of 4 domains. First domain is kind of taxonomy. That's the -1. Then you have policies and procedures. That's a -2. The system, when you look under system under consideration, that's a -3. And then there's a -4, which deals with the components that go into the OT environment. The 62443 is a cyber standard for OT environments. It's not a safety standard. It's a cyber standard for OT environments. And what are the main things that we should be kind of looking at, and I think that are very important in this standard, or in understanding how to manage risk in OT environments? I would say one of the most important things that we can understand and we can see by the standard is that it's business driven. And saying very, very simply, take the crown jewels and put them in a box and define them as a system under consideration. And that system, you would give it security assurance level. What is the security assurance that you wish to have against cyber attacks in this box? And divide your production areas into these different boxes, and to each one of them assign a security assurance level. In the standards, the security assurance level is measured by SLT, security level target. And to each one of those security assurance levels, if you want to reach a very high security assurance level, you would be asking for security level target 4. And that means putting a lot of security controllers in order to mitigate the risk, the likelihood of the risk. And if something is at a low security assurance level, then you don't have to invest so much in security controllers. And the standard advises, recommends how to look at these security controllers. I think the important thing about this standard, or not this standard, but any risk management platform or methodology, is it has to be business driven. And that means you do not want to invest in security more than it's worth. And that is the way that we look at risk assessment. That is the way we look, first of all, we understand from the clients, what is the tolerable risk? How important is that box to you, that area that you've defined? If that area that you've defined is under some kind of health, safety, environmental regulation, then obviously we'll put as many security controls as possible, or the highest security assurance level, SLT4. And then we'd ask him, you know, are you willing to have an hour downtime, a day downtime a week, and so on? Quantify that into money, and then say, okay, then you shouldn't be putting more than X amount of security controllers. It's just not worth your while to invest too much in security on that certain area. That is a very important aspect where this kind of logic or methodology helps you explain to the business owners that actually security is business driven, it makes sense financially to invest in security measures and to monitor the security environments, the production environments. And that's the way we divide it, and we work according to the 62443. Another very important aspect of dividing your production area into zones is it helps us when we do continuous monitoring of the system, when an MSP and CyberProof and the guys look at the system and need to understand and monitor the system. We define certain key risk indicators that are in that system. For example, a conduit that is between zones is for us a key risk indicator. If something, a session, a user, a service, anything that we're not familiar with, or it's something a little bit new, it will raise an alert in any case. But if it raises an alert on a conduit, then obviously we prioritize that because we've defined and understood that this is a conduit. This service or this user is crossing zones now, and it's going from a low-level security assurance level box to another one, which is a higher security assurance level, and we ask why, and that is part of our mission. To understand the contextual information, not just the, let's say, the technical information. You can see here a screenshot of the system and that we use, and you can see that we follow the full risk methodology. We'll go through it in the next 25 minutes. You know, identifying the threats, identifying the vulnerabilities, determining the unmitigated risk and the tolerable risk of that you're willing to you know, to get hit with. Define the zones, define the likelihood, and so on and so forth. So the way the standard or the cyber standard works is exactly according to the methodology of risk, and we'll look also a little bit at the NIST to show the full methodology. So yes.
Rani, just one question that I have around that is, so we talked about identifying threats yesterday. So in order to identify threats, there is probably a number of different things that we need to collect as part of that threat profiling process, isn't it? So maybe, before we go into this, maybe can you just walk us through how are we going to get some of these information so that we are able to identify those threats as part of this process?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so got a laser pointer here. Can you see the laser pointer? Yeah. Okay, cool. Okay, so in order to identify the threats, the first thing we will do, and I'll go to it in the next few slides, is first of all to understand the production network and to understand what are the possible scenarios that can play out. And in order to identify these threats, first of all, we would look at the threat actors. So if you remember, we are looking for something very different than what usually is looked at in the OT industry. And if there's OT guys now here, which are familiar with safety, we are now looking at something slightly different because we're actually looking at sabotage. And sabotage is threat sources with an intention to cause a threat or a loss. Usually when we deal with safety issues, we look at the components, we check them in a lab, we do kind of a probability tree, we've checked thousands of them, we've put them through their pace, and then we can say exactly, or within a scope, what is the failure rate, what is the mean time between failures, and so on and so forth. And according to that, we can decide and understand if something is going to go bad, or what is the probability of that something going bad. And from that, we obviously define maintenance and so on and so forth. When you talk about threat sources in cyber, that's intentional. So it's very hard to do the probability the way we do probability when we look at components. And the way we first look at the different threat actors, and I'll show that in the next few slides, we look at threat actors, what are their capabilities in your region and in your sector. Then we go and look at the likelihood or the intention they have, and I'll go into it a little bit more in a few. We're still in taxonomy in a few slides. Obviously, their ability, we look at the way they can act, and from there, and we match that to your network and to your profile, and from that we can understand how what is the likelihood or what is the opportunity that those threat actors have to act. And when they act, one of our main goals is to understand the vector of attack and what loss event will happen. And then we look at the vulnerabilities that might be affected by that attack, and obviously the predisposing condition, the security controls, and from here we go to the impact. Now, this is something that when I started the talk, if you remember, we were talking about that the most difficult part for us when we want to stand in front of the board and quantify things and explain why we're asking for a budget and what is our risk methodology, because at the end of the day, risk comes down to dollars and cents. We try to explain the way, or this is our methodology of how we calculate. Today, there's mainly a statistical or a stochastic way of calculating, and that is done by statistical or SIP math probabilities, which OpenFair, we also use the OpenFair. But before we use the OpenFair, it is very important, and again, I will go deeper into it in a few slides. When we look at the vulnerabilities of a network, we need to also understand the predisposing conditions. Predisposing conditions can be anything like the architecture of the network. That's a predisposing conditions. It can be the process, the actual production process. It might have certain stages, certain points that are more vulnerable. For example, maintenance. So when maintenance comes in, that is a predisposing condition that raises the risk. Pervasiveness of the network, again, your network topology, the privileges that have been given, whether it's remote access or internal access. All these things have to be taken into account. The security controllers that are already in the network, which are hopefully security mitigators or risk mitigators, and with effectiveness, i.e. KCI, key control indicators, are these security controllers implemented correctly? As you mentioned before, for example, configuration fault. is a vulnerability in security controllers, and that it will affect the scoring of this box that we call vulnerability. So not necessarily if you've got a security controller in place, does it mitigate this vulnerability if it's badly configured. So all these things have to be taken into account when we do a risk assessment and when we look at this box of the vulnerabilities and the network predisposing conditions. And I'm not talking only about the network. Predisposing conditions can also be in process and procedures. And at the end of the day, when a threat actor acts on this environment with a predisposing condition and the pervasiveness and the vulnerabilities, using his techniques and tactics, what is the probability of the success? So the way we actually do it is we do a virtual breach attack simulation. I'll go into a few slides in a minute. We do a breach attack simulation to get some data points of the ability when a threat meets a vulnerability at a certain network with certain preconditions. Nothing generic. We actually look at each client's network and simulate this breach attack simulation in order to get data points. And only after we get those data points do we start doing statistical simulation in order to get some kind of distribution. Again, there's a big debate on distribution. Is the distribution a normal distribution? Is it a distribution that has a hump to the left or hump to the right when you look at the distribution? It's not a Gauss distribution. And again, we take all these things into account, hopefully by using the data points that we collected in the first phase of the breach attack simulation, and then getting distribution, because we can't do hundreds and hundreds of virtual breach attack simulations, vector attacks. So after we get a data set, we then use statistical in order to get the distribution.
So Rani, just to add to that, so what
Sure.
what you're saying is that the breach attack simulation is basically the method that we use to validate that there is this threat or the risk exists, isn't it? And the simulation, it's not running on the real environment. It's more, we are taking the data from the data sets, like you mentioned, and then executing that in a virtual environment without impacting the customer environment. Yeah.
Correct. The unique aspect here that when we do this, using both of the methods of vector attack and statistical attack, currently a lot of our clients are using only statistical. So the data that comes in is actually kind of minimum, average, and high. And they will say something like, oh, I presume there'll be a 20% minimum success of this attack. Medium will be a 40 and high will be 60. And let's put it into a simulation, which is a statistical simulation. The thing is, when you use statistical simulations and you put in very large ranges, the good thing is that, you are trying to get some kind of insight into an area that currently we're blind. The area of cyber is not like car insurance, where we've got so many years of data sets and databases and actuary. This is a very new area. And not only is it a new area, it's an area that's not necessarily acting on random variables. So when you use only statistical, then you might put a range in and get a very large range as your output. What I mean is, they will say your risk is between $10 and $20 million. And if you say to somebody something like that, I'm exaggerating obviously, but you'll say that's too big a range. It doesn't make any sense to me. I can't take a decision based on that. So what we're trying to do is simulate some data sets from your production environment with your threat actors via a simulated environment. And from there, getting the data sets in order to bring them in to a statistical simulation. Okay, so now,
Rani, just to let you know, so just
sure.
in the interest of time, let's just kind of move a little bit faster as well.
Sure.
So just to
that was the most important part of the explaining the way we do risk. We're now 27 minutes in, and let me know exactly 28. let me know exactly when you want me to speed up and so on. Okay, so now we're coming to, we've understood, hopefully, and if you've got questions, that would be great. How does it work and how do we do it? Boots on the ground, that was great theory, but how does it all happen? Okay, so the first way it has to be done is collection. You have to collect the assets, the vulnerabilities of your network. So we put in an IDS, a passive IDS, because not to be inline in your network in any way. And then we get all the information that we can on your assets, the links between them, who talks to who, what protocol. Once we have that information, we obviously index the vulnerabilities of assets and protocols to this topology. And we call that a digital image. And that is the first stage that we need to do in order to understand the environment, i.e. the predisposing conditions that are present. So that's the way we look at vulnerabilities and the predisposing conditions. Later on, we'll see a slide how we put in the security controllers. And this is by doing a link analysis map, we understand the pervasiveness of the network. So this is this part of the equation, understanding this box of your digital image, your environment, your vulnerabilities, and is your network pervasive. The next stage, which is very important, it's the beginning of the mashing of IT and OT. We ask the automation heads, the clients, to map out the production. And then we take the production process and the different zones and the different business processes in the production, and we lay them on top of our IT network. More and more of the production environments in a lot of the sectors are becoming IT-based. Once they used to be standalones, not any longer. And our job now is to meet this block plan of the production and match it to the assets, the underlying assets of the infrastructure. So that is the next stage that we do. We understand which assets that we see here in our IT infrastructure and how do they relate to the business process and the production. Once we've done that, we can start dividing the network into the different zones. And from the zones, the system will automatically identify the conduits. Again, a very important aspect of understanding how to do SecOps. So when an alert comes up to the SOC, to the CDC, and it comes from a source that is a conduit, then obviously it will have a tag of higher priority because we need to look at these gateways between zones in a different way. And this is where IT meets OT. This is where each one of the assets that we've discovered automatically via passive listening to the traffic, each one of these assets will be identified by our RDS as a certain type, HMI, PLC, a server, and so on and so forth. With the client, this is where we do the production division. We will assign each one of these assets to a business process, and each business process, the client will give an impact. Currently, our system is qualitative, i.e. 1 to 5. So impact can be low, a 1, and a 5 can be high. Behind those qualitative levels of 1 to 5, obviously there's quantitative levels. So a 5 will be health, safety, environmental. Number 4 will be an impact of 5 million. Number 3 will be an impact of 3 million, and so on and so forth. So there are numbers behind this qualitative marking. So client input is impact, client input is the division into zones and so on and so forth. The system does give a recommendation out of the box, but then again, there's always fine-tuning that has to be done. Once this has been done, then you're on your way to compliance and to doing risk assessments. The system will now start simulating attacks in order to understand exactly what is happening and what are your top loss scenarios. And I'll explain in a second, the next slide. I hope it's the next slide. I'll explain exactly how we do that. But what we actually are doing now is we are taking different APTs from your sector and your environment. We're simulating it in the breach attack simulation, the virtual breach attack simulation. And each one of the attacks, we see whether or not it can cause a threat, a loss. The loss can be damage to property, can be loss of availability, loss of control, loss of safety. And in each one of the zones, you can see here the zones or the business processes, we show you what impact that you've defined it. These are the high impacts, these are the low impacts. The system's results of the threat simulation, the likelihood, and obviously as an output, the risk, the overall risk score. So this is now the way we actually mash the two aspects of impact and threat likelihood. So we are taking now, in order to understand the ability of a threat actor to cause a loss event, we have modeled all the APTs using the MITRE framework. We're using all the APTs and we modeled them. And now we're simulating them and attacking your network, your digital image. And from there, from simulating these attacks of these different adversary groups using the APTs, and also inputting the controls that you have in your network, and we have a different algorithm, different controls, what mitigations are they efficient against what attacks are they efficient. The simulation now goes into a kind of race conditions, simulating attacks of the adversaries in your region, in your sector, with different relevancy and weight. The weight, the threat capability is according to the ATTs, the techniques and tactics of that adversary. We give them a weight because some of them can be very advanced and some of them are not very advanced. And then we simulate those attacks on your network in order to understand whether or not a loss scenario can happen and what is the probability of that loss scenario happening. We have a quiz.
Yeah, so just to remind everyone, Ben is going to post the quiz link in the chat, and if we can all be logged in, we prefer it to be your mobile, then you can log in and start answering to the questions when we start the quiz. So just a reminder, and Ben have just posted that into the chat.
They're going to say what the prize is, or is that a secret?
Maybe you can if you want to announce that. That's
no, you announce. I mean, you guys.
Yeah, so I'll let Ben announce that as well. So there is a prize for the winner of the quiz as well. So
yeah,
we'll let Ben announce that. All right.
Yeah, there's Ben. Ben.
The prize will be something to do with OT. That's all I'll say. It's something to do with OT, and you'll receive it.
Yeah, you get it.
So log in.
Full generator set, delivered to your home. Anyway, let's continue. We've got a few more slides. I think I've got another 4 or 5 minutes. So we've talked about the vulnerability. So we've covered that vulnerabilities. We map the vulnerabilities, and from there we start determining the likelihood. So the likelihood is actually, we're taking all these different adversaries, as I mentioned before. We're using the MITRE frame attack, and we're simulating the way they work on your digital image. So we know what your vulnerabilities are, your network vulnerabilities, your vendors, your protocols, the pervasiveness of your network, because we've mapped the link analysis map. we're simulating all those, and after we get those data points, then we go into an open fair simulation whereby we start doing kind of statisticals to see distribution and variance and to get some insights in order to calculate risk. So I'm not saying that this process is perfect, but it's definitely gives you insights to a situation where before you had very, very little understanding of what's going to happen. So the magnitude loss side, this is something that's I'm showing here now the open fair, the open group fair. You see the open fair down here. So the magnitude of the loss is something that lends itself to be quantitative, and we can put in numbers, as I mentioned before, and we can understand after we're doing this statistical or randomization of the simulation, Monte Carlo and stuff like that, we can get all these average losses and so on and so forth. The trick is then going into the loss, the probability of loss, and this is where resistance strength is the way we put in values after we've got some data points from a breach attack simulation, because we actually can understand which mitigators to put in place and are they efficient against your attack vectors, those adversaries that are in your region. So now we've quantified on data-driven inputs or data points according to the resistance strength. Threat capability always, we keep the same because we haven't knocked out any of your adversaries, so we're not going to change that. But we are going to play around with different mitigation controls using the 62443, the fundamental requirements, to understand, are they efficient in order to raise your resistance threat in relationship to your adversaries. So from understanding resistance threat, we can then understand the probability of action. Probability of action can be, let's say, the opportunity of a threat actor to hit you. It can be that it's his line of work, and that's what he does in your region and in your sector. He's found some vulnerability in your controller or in your kind of process, but it also can be because you just happen to be there and your resistance was low. So obviously your exposure level was very high and it will hit you, for the simple reason that your resistance strength was low. So from resistance threat strength and threat capabilities that we've modeled according to our algorithm, we can then give some insights into the probability of action. So we're trying now to this area that used to be dark magic called loss event frequency. We're now trying to bring in data and have it data driven in order to take our decision. Obviously, the system is a decision support system to the cyber matter expert, but it does give you a lot of insights to understand how to deal with loss event frequency and the threat event frequency and the threat likelihood. So this area here is very, very important in order to try and quantify or have data-driven risk assessment.
So Rani, just one thing on the previous slide. So is that the reason why we want, we are doing the two types of simulations? We talked about statistical simulation and then breach and attack simulation as well. So is that the reason why, we are trying to do it in two different methodologies as well?
Exactly. We are mashing those two methodologies together. The first one gives us the results, the sample from threat capability meeting a resistance strength. So basically here you can see the adversary with his skills and resources and everything meeting your security controllers. This is where they meet. And from here, from doing a breach attack simulation, we'll take that information and then run it thousands and thousands of times in statistical Monte Carlo to understand, can we get any insights on distribution and probabilities? So we mash the open fair methodology with the breach attack simulation methodology. And I think it's the last slide, or one before last, and I'm 42 minutes in, so we're good on time. At the end of the day, you need to communicate the results. And communicating the results is usually in two ways. One is risk, and that is the area that I prefer talking about. And have I reduced the risk? Have I not reduced the risk? Do I bring business value to the company? Yes or no? Is the investment in cybersecurity working out and actually reducing your susceptibility for a loss event? And the other one is compliance, which is also very important. That's another service that CyberProof gives together with us to OT environments, that now basically you can enter the controllers you have in order to do the simulation. And if you already entered the controllers in order to understand risk, then why not just click a button and get a full risk assessment report according to the 62443, showing security level achieved and security level targets in each one of the zones, and so on and so forth. So a full ZCR5 IC 62443 compliance report by a push of a button. And the last slide is our vision, and our methodology is continuous. Risk is now changing all the time. Currently, our clients, the market, the industry is doing a risk assessment once a year. 3 months after the risk assessment, I'm not sure how relevant it is. Your adversaries are changing, new ATTs and CVEs are coming out all the time, vulnerabilities are coming out, techniques and tactics are coming out. You're changing your environment, you're buying in new lines, you're buying in new vendors, chain of supply, and so on and so forth. The environment is very, very dynamic nowadays, and risk is not something that can do yearly or every 6 months. It has to be continuous, and it has to be monitored. Each change of the things that I've just mentioned in your network will change your risk score, and you have to react in a proactive manner. So thank you very much. 44 minutes. I think I'm more exactly on time.
Yeah, so thanks, Rani. So appreciate it. And I think that to conclude, I just wanted to kind of say, as we know, the OT environment is one of the most sensitive part of any organization's infrastructure risk, and actively and effectively identifying and mitigating risk is extremely important. And this is why I think it is essential to have, this continuous visibility of the environment and get a good handle of the security risk in these environments. And like Rani said, as the threat landscape changes, new vulnerabilities are identified every day, and attackers come up with new techniques and tools. We need to make sure that our cyber defense capabilities can adapt to these changes. And fundamental way to stay on top of this is to have a good understanding of the risk, maintain that continuous visibility to identify suspicious activities, and also proactively be able to respond to these kind of threats based on the capabilities that is offered by a SOC. And the SOC can, as we all know, can provide that continuous monitoring and perform a detailed analysis of the suspicious activities, taking in input from, for example, threat intelligence teams and sources. And this also helps the SOC team to get information from these continuous risk assessment and compliance monitoring technologies and capabilities. And based on that, the SOC analyst can actually build an effective response capability to contain these threats and also minimize the impact to the organization going forward. So once again, Rani, thanks a lot for your time. And this concludes our session. And I'm going to hand it over to Ben